You see another couple laughing at dinner. Or someone posts a small gesture online, flowers, a note, a sentence you wish someone had said to you. And for a second, you don't judge your relationship by what it is. You judge it by what it seems to be missing. There's a thought most people never say out loud, not because it's cruel, not because they don't know it's there, because saying it would make it real. They used to be different. Other couples don't seem to have this problem. I didn't think it would feel like this. These are comparisons, and when they stay silent, they don't disappear. They become the lens you start seeing the other person through. Today, I want to show you 7 of the most common silent comparisons in relationships, where they come from, and what they quietly do over time. None of them feel like damage while they're happening. That's what makes them worth naming. My name is Daniel Mercer, and one of the things I've noticed consistently in how dissatisfaction grows in relationships is that it rarely starts with something that happened. It starts with something that's being measured. Most comparisons in relationships are never spoken, not because they're too harsh to say, but because they feel too private, too close to something the person isn't ready to examine. So they stay internal, silently tracked. And the conclusions drawn from that silent tracking shape how one person sees the other without the other person ever knowing they're being evaluated. The result is a gap between what one person is experiencing privately and what's actually being communicated. And in that gap, resentment can grow without either person quite understanding where it came from. Here are the 7 comparisons that create it. Number 1. Comparing them to who they used to be. This is perhaps the most common comparison in long relationships. A memory of how things were early on, of how they behaved, of how the relationship felt, held up against the present. And it's not always nostalgic. Sometimes it's accusatory. The unspoken thought, you used to make more effort. You used to be more present. You used to care in a way that was more visible. What makes this comparison particularly difficult is that it's often partially accurate. People do change in relationships. Effort does shift. The intensity of early connection rarely sustains itself at the same level indefinitely. But the past version is not a fair standard. It's a compressed, selective memory, the highlights of a period that also had its own struggles, just different ones. Held against the present, it will almost always win, because memory edits, and the person being silently compared to a past version of themselves has no way to respond to it, because it's never said. They just notice, over time, that something feels slightly off, that they seem to be falling short of something they can't see. Number 2. Comparing your relationship to other people's. Other people's relationships are visible now in a way they never used to be. Curated, filtered, selectively shared. And the comparison isn't always conscious. You see something, a gesture, a trip, a way one person talks about another, and something in you registers. We don't have that. Or, they seem easier together than we are. What you're seeing, almost always, is a surface. The inside of someone else's relationship is never visible. The effort behind the gesture, the argument that happened the night before the trip, the distance that exists alongside the warmth. None of that appears in what you're comparing against. But the comparison doesn't wait for that information. It forms anyway, and it quietly lowers the ceiling of what feels possible, creating a version of your relationship that is always slightly less than some imagined alternative. That imagined alternative is not a real relationship. It's a projection. But it shapes real feelings, and those feelings, unspoken, become part of the atmosphere between two people. Number 3. Comparing how much effort each person makes. This one feels different from the others, because it's not about memory or other couples, it's about fairness, about whether what's being given is being matched. And there's something real in it. Relationships do involve contribution. Effort does matter. Asymmetry, when sustained, does create problems. But the tracking of effort, silent, internal, cumulative, is one of the most corrosive things that can happen in a relationship. Because what gets tracked is rarely everything. It's the visible things, Who reached out last? Who planned something? Who apologized? The invisible things. Who held back resentment? Who chose patience? Who absorbed something difficult without saying so? Those don't get counted. And so the ledger is always incomplete, and the conclusions drawn from an incomplete ledger are always, at least partly, wrong. The person being measured against that ledger doesn't know they're losing. They're operating on a completely different accounting system, or none at all. And the gap between the two private systems quietly becomes the gap between the two people. Number 4, comparing them to your expectations. Before this relationship, and during it, you formed ideas about what a partner would be. Some of those ideas were conscious. Many were not. They came from what you grew up watching, from previous relationships, from what you told yourself you needed, from images of partnership that felt right without ever being examined. And the person you're with, being a specific, particular human being, fits some of those ideas and not others, which is true of every person and every relationship. But when the gap between expectation and reality is never examined, the person who doesn't fit becomes, in some private accounting, a disappointment. Not because they failed, because they weren't measured against who they actually are. They were measured against an idea. And an idea is always exactly what you need it to be: invisible, unspoken, impossible to meet. Number 5, comparing how they handle things to how you do. This one tends to arrive in conflict, or in moments of stress when different approaches become visible. You process things differently. You communicate differently. You recover differently. And in the ordinary texture of shared life, those differences are usually manageable. But under pressure, during an argument, during a difficult period, they become more visible. And something happens in those moments. An internal comparison forms. They're handling this wrong. They're not doing what I would do. The way they're reacting is making this harder. What often goes unnamed in that comparison is different doesn't mean wrong. The way you would handle something is not the objective standard. It's just the one that feels most natural to you. But when that comparison runs silently, when the other person is measured against your approach without that ever being said, it creates a subtle form of contempt. Not hostility, just the quiet belief that you would do this better. And that belief, sustained over time, makes it very difficult to receive what the other person actually offers. Number 6, comparing the present to an imagined alternative. This one is the most private. It's not a comparison to a real person or a real relationship, but to a version of your life that didn't happen. It arrives in quiet moments, when something is difficult, or when you're tired in a way that has nothing to do with this relationship. And the thought forms, what if things had been different? This comparison is almost never about the other person. It's about uncertainty, about the ordinary human experience of not knowing what the unchosen paths would have held. But it lands on the relationship. It lands on the person beside you, as a kind of weight they didn't put there and can't lift because they don't know it exists. And when it becomes habitual, when the imagined alternative becomes a regular companion, the relationship it's being compared against starts to feel like a limitation rather than a choice. Not because it is, because the comparison has framed it that way. Number 7, comparing who they are now to who you thought they were becoming. This one is subtle. It's not about the past, it's about a future that hasn't arrived. Early in relationships, people project. They see someone ambitious and imagine where that ambition will go. They see someone kind and assume that kindness will keep expanding. They see a direction and fall in love, in part, with where they believe it leads. And then, life happens. The ambition shifts. The direction changes. The person becomes something different from what was projected. Not worse, just different. More specific. More human. Less like the idea. Picture this. 5 years in, you find yourself thinking, I thought by now they would have. Or, I thought this part of them would have grown. The specific content changes, but the structure is the same. You're holding them responsible for not becoming something they never agreed to become. That grief, unexamined, can become resentment, and the relationship starts carrying the weight of an unfulfilled expectation neither person ever discussed. Here's what connects all 7 of these comparisons. They're all private. They all happen in the space between what's felt and what's said, and they all create a private version of the relationship, one the other person never gets to see. That internal version becomes a reference point, and the more it's consulted, the more decisions, reactions, and feelings are filtered through it, the less the actual person in front of you gets to determine how you see them. You start relating to the comparison, not to the person, to the gap between who they are and who they were, or who others seem to be, or who you expected. And the person themselves, specific, present, real, becomes slightly harder to see clearly. This is how 2 people can be together for years and still feel unknown to each other. Not because they stop sharing, because one of them, or both, has been relating to a version of the other that was assembled in private and never checked against reality. Here's what I want to say about all of this. Comparison is not a character flaw. It's not evidence of a failed relationship or a shallow person. It's what minds do, especially minds that care, that invested, that had hopes about how things would go. The comparisons on this list don't happen because someone is ungrateful or unfair. They happen because we all carry private ideas of how things should be, and those ideas don't update automatically just because we're with someone real. The question isn't whether comparison happens. It will. The question is whether it stays silent, where it can only accumulate, or whether it becomes material for an honest conversation. Most of the time, the comparison points to something real, a need that isn't being met, a hope that wasn't discussed, an expectation that was never shared, something worth saying. But it can only be worked with once it's said. As long as it stays in the background, shaping how you feel, influencing how you respond, it does its damage quietly, without either person being able to address it. If you recognized any of these comparisons in yourself, I want to offer one reframe. The comparison is not the problem. The silence around it is. Not because saying it out loud will resolve everything, but because as long as it stays unspoken, it stays unexamined. And unexamined comparisons don't stay neutral. They grow. They accumulate detail. They become more fixed, more certain, more like facts rather than feelings. When you notice a comparison forming, when you catch yourself measuring the person beside you against a past version, or another couple, or an expectation, or an imagined alternative, try to ask what's underneath it. Usually it's a need, or a fear, or a hope that hasn't been expressed yet. Say that instead. Not the comparison, the thing beneath it. Because the person you're with can respond to a need. They can hear a fear. They can meet a hope if they know it exists. They cannot respond to a comparison they don't know is happening. So give them the chance to respond to the real thing, the need, the fear, the hope underneath it. Because if you don't, you may keep looking at the person beside you and only seeing the gap.